There was blood on the welcome mat, a shattered citronella candle rolling in slow motion, and my wife moaning at the base of the staircase. Sandra Belrose, decked out in a beige windbreaker that said HOA Enforcement Liaison in Comic Sans, stood at the top of the stairs clutching a clipboard like she had just conquered enemy territory. Her face was flushed with self-righteous triumph as she declared in a shrill voice that my wife had attacked her first, though the security footage would later reveal Sandra had shoulder-checked my wife like she was going for a tackle in the Super Bowl. The morning sun cast long shadows across our lawn, highlighting the scattered papers from Sandra's clipboard and the broken heel of my wife's shoe lying 20 feet from where she fell. And then came the sound that changed everything. A deep, mechanical rumble that made the windows vibrate, growing louder with each passing second. Dogs throughout the neighborhood began barking in unison. Car alarms triggered spontaneously. The rumble became a roar as 5 military convoys in desert camo rolled onto our peaceful suburban street, their heavy tires crushing the perfect edge of Sandra's prized median garden. Sandra's triumphant expression melted into pure terror as she stammered with a quivering voice, asking if they were here for her. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, papers scattering in the wind like white flags of surrender. I replied with perfect calm that no, they were here because she had tampered with federal property disguised as our mailbox, and her face went from red to ghost white in less than 3 seconds. My name is Rachel Chen, and I work as a software consultant for my home office in Meadowshire, a previously peaceful neighborhood of 73 houses that became ground zero for HOA tyranny when the nearby Crestview Estates Board decided to expand their jurisdiction through something they called neighborhood beautification partnerships. Before Sandra arrived, our biggest controversy was whether Jim Peterson's inflatable Santa should come down before Valentine's Day. We had block parties where everyone actually showed up, kids played street hockey without permits, and nobody measured grass height with military precision. What that partnership really meant was that power-hungry busybodies like Sandra could now terrorize us with their measuring tapes, violation notices, and an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure regulations that may or may not have actually existed. Sandra Belrose was Crestview's self-appointed Director of Residential Standards, a title she had printed on business cards in gold foil, along with a personal website and QR code linking to her 47-page manifesto on suburban excellence. She drove a white Mercedes with a license plate that read Rolls 1 and had installed amber flashing lights on top that she claimed gave her emergency vehicle status. Her trunk contained a mobile filing cabinet with color-coded folders for every house in the neighborhood, laminated photos dating back 5 years, and enough measuring devices to stock a hardware store. She carried a tablet loaded with drone footage of every property in a 3-mile radius, which she updated weekly during what she called her aerial compliance surveys. Her reign of terror began the day I installed a custom mailbox shaped like a vintage microphone, a gift from my wife for our 10th anniversary that she had commissioned from a local artist. The violations started immediately, like she had been waiting for any excuse to pounce. First, passive-aggressive notes tucked under windshield wipers about proper postal receptacle standards, each one longer and more condescending than the last. She cited federal postal regulations, state guidelines, and even tried to invoke international mail treaties. Then came certified letters citing obscure subsections of architectural guidelines we had never agreed to follow, delivered at exactly 8 a.m. on Saturday mornings when she knew we would be home. She photographed our house from every conceivable angle, creating a PowerPoint presentation that she presented to anyone who would listen. She even filed a complaint with the city claiming our garden gnome collection constituted a commercial display that violated residential zoning laws. She measured the distance between each gnome, calculated their total square footage of visual impact, and submitted a 20-page report with graphs and charts. My wife Rachel tried to be diplomatic, baking Sandra her famous chocolate chip cookies and attempting neighborly conversation over coffee, but Sandra responded by photographing our trash cans from 17 different angles at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, then sending us a detailed analysis of proper bin placement with animated diagrams. The situation escalated dramatically when Rachel spotted Sandra in our backyard at 2 in the morning, measuring the height of our hedges with a laser level while wearing night vision goggles she had purchased from a military surplus store. Rachel confronted her politely through the window, but Sandra screamed about community standards, waving a binder full of hedge height violations from the past decade. She threatened to have us blacklisted from every HOA in the state through her connections with the National Association of Residential Standards, which we later learned was just a Facebook group she had created with 7 members, 5 of whom were her alternate accounts. We installed security cameras the next day, 8 of them covering every angle of our property, never imagining they would capture evidence of assault and federal crimes that would make the evening news across 3 states. What Sandra did not know What nobody in the neighborhood knew except for two federal handlers who lived 3 streets over under assumed names, was that Rachel was not just a marketing manager for a tech startup. She held ATSSCI clearance as a contractor for the National Security Agency, specializing in emergency communication systems for continuity of government operations. That vintage microphone mailbox was not decorative yard art from Etsy. It housed a secure emergency communication relay, part of a classified network called Project Silent Echo designed for rapid response scenarios in case of electromagnetic pulse attacks or other communication blackouts. The device looked like quirky yard art that might sell for $200 at a flea market, but it contained technology worth more than most people's houses, including quantum encryption processors and satellite uplink capabilities that could function even if every cell tower in the country went dark. So when Sandra showed up that Tuesday morning at 7:43 a.m. with a crowbar she had spray-painted gold to match her business cards and a court order she had somehow obtained from a sympathetic judge who happened to be her second cousin, claiming the mailbox violated Municipal Code Section 12.4 subsection J regarding non-standard postal receptacles, Rachel had no choice but to intervene. She rushed out in her pajamas and slippers to stop Sandra from compromising national security, speaking in a firm but controlled tone about needing to see proper documentation and waiting for legal counsel. Sandra responded by screaming that she was the legal counsel for the HOA, then shoving Rachel backward with both hands using what looked like a technique she had learned from a self-defense video, sending her tumbling down our front steps while screaming about her authority as an HOA official and how the neighborhood would thank her for maintaining standards. The second Rachel hit the ground, her head striking the third step with a sickening crack that I heard from my office, an automated alert triggered in 7 different government facilities. Somewhere in a bunker beneath Mount Weather, red lights started flashing and automated systems began their protocols. My phone buzzed with a message I had only seen in training exercises, the screen turning red with text that simply read Cardinal Breach Protocol activated. Response team deployed. ETA 8 minutes. Sandra stood at the top of our steps, actually dusting off her hands like she had just finished a tough job, completely unaware that she had just triggered a national security response that would cost taxpayers $4.7 million. 7 minutes and 30 seconds later, our quiet street looked like a scene from a Michael Bay movie. 5 armored vehicles surrounded our property, their engines still running, creating a barrier that blocked every possible exit. Soldiers in full tactical gear established a perimeter, their boots crushing Sandra's perfectly maintained lawn edge that she had spent 6 months cultivating. A black helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight illuminating Sandra's Mercedes despite it being broad daylight. 2 drones hovered at different altitudes, their cameras focused on our front porch. And stepping out of the lead vehicle was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose expression could have frozen lava and whose service record included 3 tours in Afghanistan and a stint protecting nuclear facilities. Sandra stood frozen on our porch, her golden crowbar dangling uselessly from one hand as she watched her HOA kingdom crumble before her eyes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Colonel Mitchell announced in a voice that cut through the morning air like a blade that this area was now under federal jurisdiction pending investigation of interference with classified defense infrastructure, and that all civilians except the residents were to evacuate immediately. Sandra tried to speak but only managed a pathetic squeak that sounded like a balloon losing air. The colonel continued, her words measured and precise, explaining that Sandra had committed multiple federal felonies including tampering with government property valued at over $8 million, assault on a federal contractor with security clearance, and compromising national security assets that were part of a broader defense network protecting against foreign interference. The neighbors began gathering despite the evacuation order, phones out, recording everything and live streaming to social media. Within minutes, #HOA Karen was trending locally. Sandra's face cycled through every shade of pale as she realized her HOA violations were nothing compared to federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. She started babbling about not knowing, about just enforcing neighborhood rules that were clearly posted on her website, about her rights as an HOA board member certified by an online course she had taken. She pulled out her phone to call her lawyer, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it, the screen shattering on the concrete. Colonel Mitchell cut her off with a raised hand and began reading from an official document that seemed to go on forever. Violation of the Espionage Act, Section 793. Assault resulting in potential compromise of classified materials, Section 1001. Destruction of government property exceeding $1 million in value. Interference with national defense systems during a period of heightened security. Unlawful entry onto restricted federal property, as our yard had been designated a secure zone without public notification. Each charge carried potential prison time measured in decades, not months, with mandatory minimums that would keep her behind bars until she was elderly. Sandra's legs gave out and she collapsed onto our porch steps, the same steps where she had pushed Rachel just minutes earlier, her designer handbag spilling its contents including 3 measuring tapes, 2 levels, and a folder labeled violation documentation. The Crestview Estates board president, Harold Whitman, arrived in his golf cart with custom HOA flags fluttering from the rear, demanding to know what was happening to his star enforcer who had issued more violations in 6 months than the previous board had in 5 years. When Colonel Mitchell explained the situation in detail, including the potential conspiracy charges for anyone who had aided Sandra's campaign of harassment, he literally backed his golf cart into a fire hydrant trying to distance himself from Sandra, water spraying 20 feet into the air and soaking his polo shirt. Within the hour, an emergency board meeting was called at the community center. The vote to remove Sandra from all HOA positions was unanimous, with board members practically fighting each other to condemn her actions first and leak disparaging quotes to the local news crews that had arrived. Someone had already changed her parking spot sign from reserved HOA director to visitor parking. Federal prosecutors arrived before noon in a convoy of black SUVs with tinted windows. Sandra's lawyer, a local real estate attorney named Jeff Morrison who usually handled property disputes over fence heights, was completely out of his depth and actually asked if they could handle this in small claims court. The lead prosecutor, a woman who had successfully prosecuted international spy rings, responded by presenting security footage from 12 different angles, witness statements from 43 neighbors who had documented Sandra's harassment over the past year, and a damage assessment showing Sandra's actions had triggered a nationwide security alert that had placed 3 military bases on high alert and scrambled fighter jets from 2 Air Force installations. The total cost to taxpayers was calculated at over $3 million just for the immediate response. The plea deal negotiations were swift and brutal, taking place in our living room while Sandra sat in handcuffs. Sandra faced a minimum of 5 years in federal prison, but the prosecutors were willing to deal if she cooperated fully and provided information about how she had obtained the fraudulent court order. The final agreement, reached after 6 hours of Sandra sobbing and begging, included 2 years in minimum security federal prison, 3 years supervised release where she could not serve on any boards or committees, 400 hours of community service specifically at veterans facilities cleaning bathrooms and washing dishes, and a fine of $75,000 that would wipe out her retirement savings and force her to sell her Mercedes. As the judge read the sentence in federal court 3 months later, Sandra stood in an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her professionally styled hair that was now showing gray roots. Her husband had filed for divorce, her house was in foreclosure, and her precious HOA had banned her from entering the community center. When the judge announced the $75,000 fine on top of her prison sentence, she let out a wail that echoed through the courtroom, realizing her HOA enforcement career had cost her everything she had ever worked for in her life.